All week long, a passage has been running through my mind. It's found in Isaiah 58. God says in that first verse, "Cry aloud, spare not. Lift up thy voice like a trumpet, and show my people their transgression, and the house of Jacob their sins." And just said that has just been going through my mind all week long as I've been trying to work on this next part of the series that we're doing on the Alpha and the Omega. Jesus has said that without me, you can do nothing. And if he is not honored in our assemblies as the chief counselor, our planning comes from no higher source than from human minds, and thus it is of no value whatsoever. I want to share with you a couple of statements. We're going to be looking at a lot of quotations from magazines, Pioneers, Spirit of Prophecy, Scripture Today. And the first of these is taken from Manuscript Releases, Volume 9. And I want you to look closely at this. The sins against which ancient Israel were warned have led modern Israel into byways and forbidden paths. The professed people of God have made those who are trampling underfoot his commandments their counselors. They have weakened their hold on God by uniting in politics with unbelievers. The influence of this course of action is a great offense to God, and he cannot and will not prosper those who follow it. We are to work distinctly in God's lines, refusing to follow worldly practices. That counsel came to us a long, long time ago, but we tend not to want to follow the counsel that God sends us. To our great shame, we have entered into those forbidden paths. We have united with unbelievers. We have made them our counselors, and we have greatly offended God by following worldly policies and practices. We, my friends, as God's people, much too frequently choose our own will and our own way, and as a result, God's will is often overruled, hindering his plans for the advancement of his work by replacing these plans of his with new worldly plans by those who are in authority. We are being led astray, and there's no way to deny this, by those who are not thoroughly established on the foundation principles of our faith. There has been a tremendous undermining of the faith that has established us as God's peculiar people, and we have entered into those forbidden paths, and as such, God cannot prosper those who walk in those paths. There are men and women who are standing at the head of our various institutions, as well as conferences and unions around the world, who do not rightly represent the principles of the kingdom of God. We have our leaders, as did ancient Israel, who walk not in the Lord's instruction. Jeremiah called out concerning this a long time ago. God spoke through the prophet and said, "Obey my voice, and I will be your God, and you shall be my people, and walk ye in all the ways that I have commanded you, that it may be well unto you." But they hearkened not, nor inclined their ear, but walked in the counsels and in the imagination of their evil heart. And they went backward and not forward. Isn't that sad? That was sad for ancient Israel, and it is sad for us today. We should be a whole lot further on than what we are. As a matter of fact, the servant of the Lord has said we should already be home. And I don't think any of us think we're home yet. And if you do, then you have not realized that this world is not your home. We are looking at 20 points that reveal the shaking. We've already looked at the rejection of righteousness by faith and deception, false theories and doctrines. We've studied the divisiveness and the fundamental beliefs that are being attacked. We've looked at the rejection of established truth and the political struggles in the church. We looked the last time we were together at a restructuring of the church, and today we are going to look at a compromising in the medical work. A long time ago, and I knew James White had said this, it just took me quite a while to find it this week. I want you to see what James White had to say just weeks before his death. He says, "My life has been given to the upbuilding of these institutions. It seems like death to leave them. They are as my children, and I cannot separate my interests from them. These institutions are the Lord's instrumentalities to do a specific work. Satan seeks to hinder and defeat every means by which the Lord is working for the salvation of men. And if the great adversary can mold these institutions according to the world's standard, his object has been gained. It is my greatest anxiety to have the right man in the right place. If those who stand in responsible positions are weak in moral power and vacillating in principle, inclined to lead toward the world, there are enough who will be led. Evil influences must not prevail. I would rather die than live to see these institutions mismanaged or turned upside down from the purpose for which they were brought into existence." Can you sense the man's burden for these institutions? And he's talking about the medical work, the printing work, and the educational work. His dedication to that and him putting so much of himself into it ended up shortening his life. As a matter of fact, Ellen White rebuked some of the leaders for killing her husband by not sharing some of the responsibilities with him. I was going to speak today just on the compromising of institutions. But the more I studied, the more I realized we wouldn't get out of here till tomorrow morning if I did that. Because there was just so much as I continued studying. And so today we're going to look at the compromising in the medical work. And then the next time we'll look at compromising in the educational work. And finally we'll look at the compromising in the publishing work. There was just far too much to put it just as the institutions. So as we start with these institutions, we must understand that the great adversary of souls is seeking to bring a dead, lifeless, spiritual atmosphere into every one of our institutions. And when in our institutions anything at all that is placed above the third angel's message, the gospel will not be found there as the leading power. And that is the biggest problem that we are facing with all of our institutions. Remember, God's will is that we stand as a distinct and peculiar people, free from all worldly policy and confederation with those who have not the wisdom to discern God's claims so plainly set forth in His Word. And so I want us to look at what we were told about our institutions over 100 years ago. All our medical institutions are established as what? Seventh-day Adventist institutions. They're to be different from anything else that's out there, okay? To represent the various features of the gospel medical missionary work, and thus to prepare the way for the what? The coming of the Lord. we are to show that we are seeking to work in harmony with heaven. So do you see here, friends, that the purpose of our medical institutions, actually for all of them, but she's addressing the medical ones here, is to present the gospel and to prepare the way for the coming of Jesus Christ, and all the while to be working in harmony with the will of God. This is the purpose of it. But is it possible that we who are to preach the everlasting gospel have begun to accept perversions of the gospel in our medical institutions? Paul said to the Galatians, I marvel that you are so soon removed from him that called you to the grace of Christ unto another gospel, which is not another, but there be some that trouble you and would pervert the gospel of Christ. But though we or an angel from heaven preach any other gospel unto you than that which we have preached unto you, let him be accursed. That's pretty clear, isn't it? Now, with that in mind, let's take a look again at what the remnant prophet has told us. The exaltation of a so-called medical missionary work, while the character of the true medical missionary work has not been understood, has dishonored and displeased God. There's two types of medical missionary work supposedly going on. One is true, one is false. When we exalt the false one, the so-called one, and do not follow the true one, we dishonor and we displease God. There is danger that the church, watch this, instead of being built upon the foundation, Jesus Christ, will be marred by the introduction of objectionable, base material. That worldly policy principles will steal in as a supposed necessity in order to maintain influence with unbelievers. Now, I want you to remember that last phase as we get toward the end of this today. That it's a supposed necessity to maintain our influence with those that are not of our faith. Our institutions are not what they should be. If they were what God designed they should be, those connected with them would not pattern after worldly institutions. Does that make sense? They will stand as peculiar. They will be governed and controlled by the Bible standard. They will not come into harmony with the principles of the world in order to gain popularity, to gain patronage or monetary increase. They will not do that. No motives will have sufficient force to move these institutions from the straight line of duty for which God has set before them. But I'm afraid that as we look at this today, I'm going to be sharing some things with you today. It's going to be very hard, very heartbreaking. And I wish I didn't have to do it. But let's take a look at a couple of things. The counsel is that we are to invite everyone, the high and the low, the rich and the poor, all sects and classes, to share the benefits of our medical institutions. We receive into our institution people of all denominations. Good, right? That's the purpose of it. But as for ourselves, we are strictly denominational. We are sacredly denominated by God and are under His theocracy. So yeah, we are different than those we bring into our institutions. Otherwise, why would we need institutions if they're the same thing that they can get anywhere else out there in the world? But we, as a distinctly different denominated people, have been given a specific gospel missionary, medical missionary work to be carried out for all people. Now, those who would work in God's service must not be seeking worldly gratification and selfish indulgence. The physicians in our institutions must be imbued with the living principles of health reform. This is why we were told that our institutions should grow no larger or faster than what we have dedicated, converted Seventh-day Adventist personnel to operate them. Part of the problem we have is that we have not listened to that counsel either. And men and women, my friends, will never be truly temperate until the grace of Christ is abiding in the heart. Now, I'm going to share with you a couple of things that to some it may not sound significant, but the bite of an apple in a garden didn't seem too significant to some. God never gives counsel to be ignored. And so, notice from Counsel on Diets and Foods. And if you have this book, I'd encourage you to read it, and I would encourage you to get very angry when you do read it, because you will. I did. I didn't like a lot of stuff that was in there years ago. But there was some tremendous instruction from God to us. Instruction has been given me that physicians who use flesh meat and prescribe it for their patients should not be employed in our institutions. Did you get that? Should not be employed in our institutions because they fail decidedly in educating the patients to discard that which makes them sick. I want that to sink in for just a moment, because that was such a strong statement. She goes on and says, the physician who uses and prescribes meat does not reason from cause to effect. And instead of acting as a restorer, he leads the patient by his own example to indulge perverted appetite. You know, years ago, no, I don't want to go that far away yet. A week or so ago, I met with the administration of our hospital down in Burleson or Fort Worth. It's built on the line there, and it's Hughley Hospital. Trying to get billing done sometimes. When I did for Rex, I kept getting all this paperwork back because they said it's the wrong address. Well, one of them said Hughley Hospital, Fort Worth. The other one said Hughley Hospital, Burleson. And so the government didn't want to honor it because they didn't know where they were. But I met with Ken, the president there, and some of the vice presidents and chaplains and a few of us pastors. And I enjoyed the meeting with him. It was an enlightening experience, and I appreciate the opportunity that was presented to do that. After the meeting, we had lunch. And I'm not saying this to condemn, but just to inform. So please understand this. I went up and I went through the line, and that first thing that was up there, I thought, man, that's some unusual looking veggie meat there. I thought it was some kind of veggie chicken. And so I took a couple of pieces of that and I went on down to a couple of vegetables, and there all of a sudden I saw those little chicken nuggets, and it said vegetarian on the front of it. Red flag went up. If that one says vegetarian, it must mean the other one wasn't. So I went ahead and got the rest of the stuff, went over to Theo, the head chaplain there, and I said, Theo, that first thing up there, I said, is that? And he said, oh, that's real meat, Joe. Why? That was the administration of our hospital. That was the chaplains of that hospital. And that was about 3 or 4 of us Seventh-day Adventist pastors. Why was it even there? I just wrapped it up in a napkin and laid it off on the table there, but that should not be there according to the counsel that we've got. But I'll give you one better. You go to most of our hospitals and you go to get a sandwich out of, and this happened to me. I went in another state, in Chicago area. I went to visit a member, and afterwards it was getting in the afternoon, so I thought I'm going to grab me a bite to eat. So I went down to the cafeteria. And as I went into the cafeteria, I went through the line, and there's this big pink thing with a little round bone in it. I said, what is that? And she says, that's ham steak. I said, the real thing? She thought I was talking about Coca-Cola maybe, but she said, what else would it be? I said, I would never have thought I'd find a dead pig back there. And so I decided I'll just go over and get me a sandwich out of the vending machine. Lo and behold, besides, the roast beef sandwiches, there were ham sandwiches in the vending machine. It was our hospital. So these things are not unusual. I've experienced it in a lot of places, in a lot of our hospitals. Again, watch the counsel that God gave us. Let us make known in our institutions that there is no longer meat at the table, even for boarders. And then the education given upon the discarding of a meat diet will not only be not only saying, but doing. If patronage is less, what? So let it be. If you don't get as many patients, fine. But don't be just sayers, but doers of the message God sent us. The principles will be far greater value when they are understood, when it is known that the life of no living thing shall be taken to sustain the life of a Christian. It's an interesting statement. But now not only do they serve flesh foods to patients in all of our hospitals, but also in the cafeterias, so that you have to be careful of what you even get in the cafeteria of a Seventh-day Adventist hospital. So I'm just wanting you to see what's gradually come in here. The institutions are God's instrumentality for accomplishing His work on the earth. And for this reason, Satan is exercising his ingenuity to embarrass and to hinder. He comes with his temptations to men and women connected with these institutions, whether in responsible positions or doing the humblest work. Doesn't matter, as long as he can pull anybody away from what the purpose is to be. He seeks to ensnare them with his devices until they lose their connection with God, become confused in judgment, and are unable to discern right from wrong. So when we look at these physicians, and see, the problem we have today is most physicians in most Seventh-day Adventist hospitals are not Seventh-day Adventists. You do realize that. And this is part of the problem we have, and we'll see this in a little while here. Notice again, to have the physicians of our institutions educating by precept and example those under their care to use a meat diet after years of instruction from the Lord disqualifies them to be superintendents of our health institutes. These are some strong, strong statements, my friends. The Lord does not give light on health reform that it may be disregarded by those who are in positions of influence and authority. The Lord means just what He says, and He is to be honored in what He says. So we're not talking about individuals now. We're talking about our institutions. And God is being dishonored through our disobedience. As our scripture reading said this morning, we have committed sin. We have committed iniquity and have done wickedly and have rebelled, even by departing from thy precepts and from thy judgments. Neither have we hearkened unto thy servants, the prophets. Do any of you remember the day that you could go into one of our hospitals and there would be no smoking? You could go into our hospitals and there would be decaffeinated coffee in the waiting room, but no caffeine things, no caffeine drinks. I want you to see where this came from and what happened from back then up until now. Historically, look at this. Now, no tea, coffee, or flesh meat is served in the institution. We are determined to live out the principles of health reform, to walk in the way of truth and righteousness. We shall not, for fear of losing patronage, be half and half reformers. We have taken our position, and by God's help, we shall stand by it. You see what she's saying here? We cannot be half and half. Either we believe what God has given to us, or we don't believe it. We put away all of that stuff way back then, but slowly but surely it has all come back into the church again. The Lord has brought us into possession of our health institutions that we might learn to bring the sick in a most attractive way to the truths that are of heavenly origin. We are to give them something they get nowhere else in the world. And we must never lose sight of the fact that these institutions are God's instrumentalities in the hands of God to bring light and truth to those who are in darkness. I told a president many years ago of one of our institutions, his name also was Ken, the same as our president here. And I said, Ken, I read in the spirit of prophecy that the medical missionary work is the right arm of the gospel. And Ken grinned real big, and he said, that's right, Joe. I said, but I don't read anywhere that acute health care is. And the grin kind of went away. We've moved from medical missionary work to acute health care. Acute health care is needed. And that's why all of these other hospitals have it. But now we have just simply become like all of those other hospitals. Notice again, there are some in our institutions who claim to believe the principles of health reform, and yet who indulge in the use of flesh meats and other foods which they know to be injurious to health. I say to such, now watch this, in the name of the Lord, do not accept positions in our institutions while you refuse to live the principles for which our institutions stand. For by doing this, you make doubly hard the work of teachers and leaders who are striving to carry the work on right lines. Is it a problem that we're experiencing today, friends? Have we disregarded all of this counsel and simply become another medical institution like all of the rest of them that are out there? I don't even need to go into the amalgamation and joining with Harris or joining with the Catholics through Porter or losing the many of our institutions. There are so many things I could go on. I'm not here to point out all the problems. I just want to give you a few ideas of how we have not hearkened unto the prophet, and we are going backward instead of forward. Do you think that the Seventh-day Adventist Church might be involved in abortions in our hospitals? This is the one I really hate having to present. You know, several years ago, I did a two-part series on abortion here, and I almost got stoned for that. I can look back at that and say, oh, well, that was one really rough bump in the road. Because we had a few feminists in the church at that time, and they really took issue with that, and they went up in arms with it. And I could give you a whole kind of a story, but I'll give you two things why I'm glad I did that series. One is that a woman came up to me after the first one, and in agony and tears, she says, oh, Pastor, I am so glad you preached that sermon, because I had an abortion so many years ago. Nobody in the church even knew about it. I didn't know about it. She said, and I've been struggling with that for years, but today I found out that God has forgiven me. And she had a release. She realized that the saving grace of God will take away whatever bad thing we've done in the past. I could give you more about what happened with that dear lady and how somebody tried to distort that. And then when I did part 2, and it was over. And I don't think anybody in the church probably knows about this one. But a woman came up to me in the foyer out there. when we had a little foyer out there. And she was quite distraught, and she said, "Pastor, can I talk to you for a moment?" And as I visited with her, she told me, "I'm pregnant." She wasn't married. And she says, "I was planning on going down Monday and have an abortion. But now I know I can never do something like that." And we wept and struggled, and because of her fear of what some in the church at that time were like, she went somewhere else. She moved her membership, and only her and I knew of her predicament. And years went by, and I never saw her. And just a couple of years ago, I was down at Lake Whitney in a tent, standing in a tent there. And all of a sudden I looked over and I saw this woman. And she saw me about the same time, and she came over to where I was at, and we got to visiting. And I looked over there and I saw a little boy about 10, 11 years old, about that tall. And I said, "Is that?" And that's all I got out of my mouth. She said, "Yes, that's him. And praise God, he's alive today." So I don't care who I upset if I preach the truth, because God will bring great things to people who will accept that truth. Several years ago, when I was pastoring in Chicago, I went knocking on doors, and this one door I knocked on, the woman and I got to visiting, and I told her who I was, and she says, "Oh yeah, you Seventh-day Adventists, you operate that hospital there in Hinsdale." I said, "Yes." She says, "Oh, I really love that hospital. They were so good to us." I said, "You were in the hospital?" She said, "Yes." I said, "Oh, I hope it wasn't anything too serious." And she said, "No, I just had an abortion." That took me back, because I was still a little bit naive back then, a whole lot more naive than I am now. And I said, "Oh, were you having some complications? What was wrong?" She says, "Oh no, my husband and I figured that at our age we didn't need any more kids, and so we just decided to have an abortion." The week before that, I had talked to Ken about that, their very subject of abortions, and he assured me, "No, Joe, we do not do abortions here in the hospital." This is in about 1984, 85 probably. And so as I talked to the woman, I said, "Well, I appreciate all that you've told me." I said, "Would you mind if I share your appreciation and experience with the president of the hospital?" She says, "Oh no," she says, "do." She says, "I really appreciate." So now I had the green light to go ahead and talk to him about it. So I went right back over and I said, "Ken, you told me," and I shared with him, and I said, "And I met this woman, and here's her name, here's her phone number," and I said, "She had an abortion because she didn't want any more children." "Well, Joe, I don't understand that. It must be one of our physicians must have done that without our knowledge." That's a good way to get out of it. But this was a problem back then, and it is still a problem today. The Washington Post. These are the things that I'm very sorrowful to have to present. January 24th, 2011. Christians of all denominations are gathering on the National Mall today to protest the 38th anniversary of Roe v. Wade, the 1973 Supreme Court decision that legalized abortion nationwide. This is the prestigious Washington Post. Watch what it says. But one denomination that may be sparsely represented is Seventh-day Adventists, whose large worldwide network of 170 hospitals allows elective abortions. The denomination may be the only theological conservative Protestant group that allows elective abortions. If that doesn't make you want to weep, something's wrong. This is coming from a national paper. And they're saying this about us. I knew that there's been a problem for years. This is 2011. I'd already experienced this all the way back in the 80s. Ministry Magazine, and by the way, every one of you should get, per family, please. I printed out an article from Ministry Magazine back in August of 1991 that really gives an overview of this that is heart-wrenching. And I couldn't share all of that with you. It's a rather lengthy article. I'm going to pull just a few statements out of there so you can get an idea of what's in there. But be sure you get one. And if for some reason we run out, let me know and I'll copy some more for you. But on March 17, 1970, Neil C. Wilson, president of the North American Division, made a statement on abortion that was carried by the religious news service. 1970, Neil Wilson, the father of our current president, Ted Wilson, and this is what ministry tells us. He predicted that when the denomination met at Atlantic City in June, it would steer a middle-of-the-road course. He said that while the church would steer away from anything that would encourage promiscuousness, the church would not feel it our responsibility to promote laws to legalize abortion nor oppose them. Some of you have wondered in the past why I've always had such a problem with this man as our president years ago. I don't even want to go into that. Now watch what he says. Though we walk the fence, Adventists lean toward abortion rather than against it, because we realize that we are confronted by big problems of hunger and overpopulation. We're overpopulated. Let's kill them little boogers. Not enough food to go around. Let's get rid of them so we don't have to feed them. Adventists lean toward abortion. Is this true? Does this man speak for you? No. But yet he spoke with the authority of the church. And again, please, friends, understand. I'm trying to point out some problems rather than specific individuals. And this specific individual happens to be, or was at that time, the head of the church. People see these things. I've had Seventh-day Adventists over the years come to me, and they've read this one place or another. We're going to leave the church. It's become Babylon. We're killing babies. Friends, don't take that approach. This is still God's church. Just because there are some of these people that we looked about, unconverted, unconsecrated, worldly-minded, carnal individuals in positions in the church, does not make this church bad. It is still the one object of God's supreme regard. And I will not turn it over to these type of people. Years and years, people have tried to get me to go to work for various independent ministries that are operated that I know. And I've always told them I can't do that. Because if all of us leave the church and come to work for you guys, there's nobody left in the church. And we cannot leave the sheep without a shepherd. We cannot leave the church without a voice. Now watch this so you can see the problems and how they develop. If they, speaking of 5 or 6 non-Adventist doctors, are not allowed to do this, speaking of elective abortions, abortion on demand, just because you don't want any more children, in Castle Memorial. Castle Memorial was one of our hospitals in Hawaii. They will take their patients to other hospitals in the city of Honolulu. So you see what the hospital administration is saying. If we don't allow these 5 or 6 non-Adventist doctors to do abortion on demand, then we're afraid that they will take their patients to other hospitals to do this. Now watch. If this is done, chances are fairly good they will take their patients over there for other treatments as well. This could mean a loss of goodwill and also patronage for Castle Memorial. You see what the whole bottom line is? Money. Now, again, this is Castle Memorial Hospital. It's in a beautiful location there. It says, we recognize that Castle Memorial Hospital is a church-operated hospital, but we also feel that you must concede, speaking to the brethren, the General Conference, you must concede to being at least a quasi-public hospital in the eyes of many local residents. Do we have to worry about what local residents think of our institutions? We're a church-operated hospital, but we're really not church, we're local community. The chief, notice this, of staff wrote in a view, and this is in that ministry article, in that view of the local non-Adventist contributions to the hospital of the time and resources and the state appropriations of more than $2 million, here's what they said. We on the Medical Executive Committee feel that perhaps the local public is justified in requesting total care at Castle Memorial Hospital. By total care, it means abortions on demand. And then they go on and explain more than the $2 million. It says that federal and state monies have, for all practical purposes, made this a community hospital. They reason, therefore, that the community wishes should be taken into consideration. And I will submit to you today that's the problem with every single hospital that we have. Every one of them have done this. And every one of them consider themselves more of a community hospital than a Seventh-day Adventist institution. Now, don't get shocked when you see this one. This is not an abortion picture. This picture just meant so much. There, for the longest time, when I first got this, I could not look at this picture without weeping. Can you see what it is? There was a baby that was having health problems, and it was going to die. And the surgeon had to perform surgery on this baby, or what they like to call fetus, in the womb of the mother. And while he had the womb cut open and was working on that baby, that little baby reached out and got a hold of the surgeon's finger. Isn't that beautiful? They weren't going in there to kill it, but to save it, and they did. That little baby survived and became a healthy child. But I want you to see something. Therapeutic abortions in Seventh-day Adventist hospitals. And I've got two here to just show you that are in that article. Glendale Hospital in 1966, we had one abortion. In 67, there were 3 abortions. In 68, 4. 69, 10. And look, in 1 year after this 1970 stuff within our church, by 1970 we had 34 abortions in that one little hospital just outside of Los Angeles, a very small hospital. And the White Memorial Hospital in 1968 there were 3 abortions, 1969 12, and by 1970 there were 79 abortions performed in that same hospital. Can you see what's happening, my friends? What's taking place? We are in a tremendous situation. Again, the words of our previous president of the church. We have a report to give you regarding the interpretation or the interruption of pregnancy. Now watch this guy's wording. This is a more sophisticated term than abortions. Just call it interruption of pregnancy. You see, they play on words to make it more acceptable. And then, by the way, can you see that baby's footprint on that? Mamas don't get to see that because they can't see that part of their belly when they're in this situation. But watch what it goes on and says here. The previous administrator of that hospital in Hawaii. I believe if you do a bit of research, you will find that the majority of Adventist hospitals permit abortion on request. So can you see this, my friends? Is there a compromising in our medical work? Yes, there is. And it's happening in every one of our institutions, and we need to be aware of it so that we can speak out against it. I mean, we cannot remain silent. The Washington Adventist Hospital said some years back, "The administration, therefore, in good faith, leaves the responsibility of deciding for or against abortion to the physician and the patient." So the administration now just simply lets the non-Adventist doctors do what they want to do in a Seventh-day Adventist institution. The official position taken by the church back in the 90s was simply that abortion was to be allowed only in extraordinary circumstances. In other words, to save the mother's life or something of this nature here. We have moved a long way from that, friends. We have been compromising, and we have been compromised. And God gave us a call in Amos centuries ago. Can two walk together except they be agreed? Are we still walking with God in the operation of these institutions? Or is it perhaps that the way that we were walking with God, now we hit a fork in the road and we've begun to walk away from God? Pray for these leaders, that their eyes might be opened, that they might see the horrendous direction that they're going in leading away from the very purpose that God had for the development of these institutions.